Chapter 3 The Bog. They had settled in on that first day, and she watched her dad join a group of boys for lunch. Their table had obviously emerged victorious, as her father's skill as a human garbage disposal was, for the first time in his life, a marketable one. His reputation began spreading, and soon every table was shouting for him to join them at meals. The next morning, he had joined Sam's table, and she had made the mistake of trying a lemon poppy seed muffin, which she did not like at all. Unfortunately, it turned out to be her father's kryptonite, and they had not won the breakfast challenge because of it. The previous day, they had signed up for the activities that they were interested in, and the first thing Sam had signed up for was a hike to a local bog. She had no clue what a bog was, but Gary was the one leading it, so she had written her name almost immediately. She was hoping a bog was more of a romantic spot than the name itself sounded. Luckily, she had signed up early because there was a whole crowd of disappointed girls who would be going to the tide pools with Diane instead. They finished their breakfast and then returned to their cabins to get ready. They were told to wear layers if they had hiking boots to lace those up. Sam had never gone hiking before in her life, so instead she was wearing her cheap knockoff-looking sneakers from Payless. She had begged to get a pair of Nikes, but her mom had a strict no-name brands until you stop growing policy. And despite her feet not growing for over a year, her mother had continued the rule just in case. They met in front of the mess hall, and Sam was one of the first ones there. She stood there, sheepishly looking at the trees around her and purposefully avoiding Gary's eyes. Gary was standing there in another plaid shirt, but she noticed that he was wearing what looked like a concert tee underneath. She wanted to ask him which band it was, but was way too nervous to utter a sentence in his presence. He was standing there with a clipboard, looking around at the growing group of children surrounding him. "Sam Reese," he said. Sam's head perked up as she said, "Present," in a voice that was much smaller than her own. Gary continued his roll call, and Sam took a deep breath of relief. Suddenly, Nick was next to her. He had snuck up so quietly that when he said, "Hey, Sammy," she had almost jumped out of her skin. "Ah! Don't do that," she said as she clutched her chest. And Nick chuckled at her overreaction. She knelt over, her hands on her knees while trying to control her breathing. "Sorry, I thought you heard me," he said, knowing full well that she had not. Nick was the kind of guy who moved like a cat, or a ninja, or a cat ninja. He had been sneaking up on her since they became friends, and it was probably one of the most annoying things about him. "We both know that's not true," she said as she laughed and stood back up. She slapped his shoulder lightly, and he laughed back. Their attention was called for when Gary had finished the roll call. "All right, campers, we're about to be on our way. Now the trail is marked, but I need you to stay on the trail at all times. When we get to the bog, it is incredibly important that you stay on the trail. I'll explain further when we get there. For now, let's get going," he said with an amiable smile and wave of his hand as he started leading the way towards the trail. Her dad had opted out of the hike to the bog and was on his way to the tide pools with the other group, so Sam's only familiar face was Nick. She recognized a few people, like a boy who had been in her class at school but had moved to another elementary school 2 years ago. She waved, and he smiled and waved back. She'd always liked Timmy, who had always been really nice to her in the past. An author's note. Gary is completely made up. The bog is completely true. We did go for a hike in a bog at environmental camp when I was like 11. And unfortunately, one of the girls did stray from the trail and she fell up to her chest. And they had to pull her out, and she was just covered, and it was really scary. And she was really scared, and it was just really, really bad. So I included the bog. Also, if you've never looked up information on bogs, please do, because they're really cool. they actually naturally mummify bodies. So there was, I believe in Ireland or Scotland, which I specifically mentioned here, there was a body found in a bog, and a man was actually brought up on murder charges. And then they found out that the body was thousands of years old or something like that. It was really, really cool. I'd have to look up the story. It's been like 10 years since I've read it. But bogs are really, really, really cool places. The wildlife, again, that's actually accurate. It's mostly bugs and birds. But like the environment in a bog, the way that it naturally preserves things. So really, really, really cool. So if you can, look up information on bogs, because bogs are actually like really cool biomes. Like just really cool environments. So I wanted to definitely include that. Also, the fact that I did actually go to a bog when I was like 11, and the girl fell in, and it was like the most eventful thing that happened at environmental camp. Everybody was talking about it, and that poor girl became a celebrity on the first day or something. It was real rough. As they were hiking, Sam noticed a small group of girls who you could just tell were the popular girls at their school. The ringleader looked like she stepped out of a Delia's catalog. They all looked like they had never gone hiking a day in their lives, although Sam could appreciate that sentiment. She found herself walking right behind them and just listening to their conversation as they walked. Isn't he like so cute though, Kirsten? One of them asked the ringleader. She rolled her eyes a little and said, I guess so, if you're into the scruffy thing. Sam thought she could almost feel the disingenuous nature of her words. She could tell that Kirsten did, in fact, think he was cute. However, she was not going to lose her cool points by admitting it and acting like the other girls here. Sam contemplated this while walking silently next to Nick. This girl was obviously popular. Maybe it was because she was above fangirling about things? Earth to Sam! Come in, Sam! She heard next to her as she came to and saw Nick staring at her as they walked. Sorry, what? She asked, shaking the thought out of her head and trying to be present in the moment again. I was just asking if you read the newest Supergirl, he said again. Sam was excited to talk about the newest issue, but found herself shushing him. Shut up about that, she said, hoping that Kirsten and her little gaggle of girls hadn't heard him. She looked expectantly forwards, but the girls were still chatting amongst themselves and clearly weren't paying any attention to her or Nick. What do you mean, shut up about that? Shut up about what? The comic book we both read? Or the comic book store we hang out at almost every weekend? The one you practically grew up in? He said, each sentence increasing in volume until the girls in front of them started to notice the noise. Shh, she hissed, doing her best impression of an angry Canadian goose. She whispered angrily, no one here knows I'm into comic books, and I'd like to keep it that way. Nick looked like she had slapped him. Why? He paused thoughtfully. Why would you want that? It's something that you love. She rolled her eyes and sighed. Yeah, but it's not cool to be the girl who likes comic books. Nick's eyebrows were pinched together in confusion that looked almost tinged with a little bit of inner turmoil. He shook his head as if trying to convince himself not to say what was on his mind, but he stayed silent. They were walking up a hill when they reached the top. They saw what must have been the bog they had been hiking to. It looked like grass and moss and small bushes interspersed with some coniferous trees, but in between there were patches of water. Gary cleared his throat and stood on a large boulder so everyone could see him. So kids, this is the bog. It is a very interesting freshwater wetland found mostly in cooler northern areas like ours around the globe. You can find bogs all over this section of the country, and some of the other famous bogs are found in places like Ireland and Scotland, he explained, sounding like a National Geographic documentary. As he said that, they heard a splashing sound and a rush of wings. A rather large bird took off in flight, its large wings lazily flapping off into the distance. What you saw there, kids, was a crane. Most of the wildlife found in a bog is birds. This environment doesn't bode well for most other wildlife, but the insect presence brings a lot of birds to this area. The cranes happen to be my personal favorite. However, if you listen, he held his hand up to his ear to wait a full minute. Suddenly, they heard the quick, successive rapping of something on a tree. Gary looked incredibly pleased at the timing and with a smile said, "And that's a woodpecker, which can be found nearby. Just like Woody the woodpecker, except these ones have to dig into trees for their food." Sam looked around and noticed all the girls looking starry-eyed at him, looking at him as if he was the last cupcake at a birthday party. "All right, kids, this is paramount and very important," he said, and the girls were already hanging on his every word, but he had to bring the boys back in to listen. "While we are walking through the bog, do not stray from the trail at all. This area can be very dangerous, and if anyone strays off trail, it could be very dangerous. Does everyone understand?" he asked the group, who nodded vehemently. "Do you think Swamp Thing would jump out and kidnap you if you step off the trail?" she asked Nick, giggling. "Don't be ridiculous. Swamp Thing is a hero. He doesn't kidnap damsels in distress," he said to Sam, who rolled her eyes. "Speak for yourself. I'll never be a damsel in distress," she said, her fists ready to punch him in the shoulder if he argued. Instead, Nick just batted his eyelashes and curtsied and said in a girlish murmur, "I was speaking for myself." The two of them burst out giggling as they followed the group down the hill towards the bog. They spent an hour or so exploring the bog, but it wasn't the romantic spot she had hoped for. The bog smelled kind of funny, and most of the girls were sitting there with their sleeves over their noses to avoid inhaling the scent. There were a lot of different birds Sam had never seen before, so that was cool enough. She had been trailing behind Kirsten and her little clique for the entirety of the hike, but she hadn't found the strength to say hi or say anything for that matter. Nick was listening intently to every word Gary was saying about the bog, and Gary was sounding more and more like an educational video. Sam had lost interest about 5 minutes in and was honestly ready to go back to camp, but there was no escape until Gary decided to start the walk back. Finally, she heard Gary say, "All right, that's all we have for the bog today. Does anyone want to stay and explore a little bit more?" he asked the group. It was an almost unanimous no. Nick momentarily looked like he was going to raise his hand until Sam grabbed it and looked at him in a way that said, "If you make us stay here, I will kill you myself, and they will never find your body in the bog." He immediately shut his open mouth and nodded quietly. They had walked back to camp in a mostly silent haze, with everyone looking forward to dinner and ready to get some sleep after a very long day. As enamored as Sam was with Gary and as excited as she had been to come to camp, the disillusionment had started to seep in. She wasn't brave enough to initiate conversation with the popular girls and was too shy to try to say hi to any of the boys on the trip that she didn't know. She had stuck to Nick like glue because he was her lifeline in a sea of newness. They had dinner with Phoebe while she watched her dad finish some kid's Swedish meatballs to a round of cheers from the boys around him. Her dad had fit into this new environment seamlessly, so why couldn't she? Eventually, Phoebe and her made their way back to the cabin, and Sam curled up into her sleeping bag. She had hoped to come here and somehow reinvent herself, but instead she had never felt more invisible than she did at that exact moment. "Tomorrow will be better," she whispered quietly to herself. "I promise." She clutched her little stuffed puppy, and slowly drifted off into a quiet, peaceful slumber. Tomorrow would be a new adventure. As always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think. You can read all of the chapters on Wattpad. And remember, check out chapter 417, which is next. All right. Thank you so much again. And remember, keep being kind, keep being wonderful, keep spreading sunshine. All right. See you next time.